everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Mykyta Petik. He's a PhD student in Law and ICT in the Department of Law in KU11, and is going to talk about implementing privacy requirements in software projects. Please note that this presentation is recorded.
Thank you, Leslie Ann. I hope everyone can hear me well, and also you can see the slides on your screen. If that is the case, welcome to CIF Seminar on implementing privacy requirements in software projects. We're going to talk about some basics on how to consider possible legal issues arising from the implementation of privacy, as well as, of course, personal data protection and security requirements, issues, challenges in software projects and in software development lifecycle. Third points, what are we going to talk about today? Mentioned the difference in terminology, mostly related to differences between what computer scientists are used to and what lawyers are used to. Why should we treat data protection seriously, certain background information, and then we're going to talk about GDPR, of course. Today's session focuses on European legislation, although we will mention some international rules as well. Most of those will actually fit for most countries who have dedicated legal frameworks on protecting privacy online and in applications in software projects. We'll also talk about why should IT people care, why should software developers care in the first place, and then of course mention data protection by design, privacy by design as well, data processing impact assessment, and how those work in the software development lifecycle, as well as we'll try and analyze an SDLC use case, see how GDPR and SDLC fit together or not, certain things to consider and challenges. And the seminar will end with the possibility to ask and for me answer any questions you might have. So this presentation does not provide any tailored advice. I hope that is clear. Nor I'm going to give an explanation for each and every activity rigid when it comes to Agile development process or software development lifecycle. No, not at all. The goal of this presentation is to give an overview of legal issues, which you might take or you have to take into account when you're working on your software projects. So first things first, it's the terminology and the difference in terminology. So privacy from the legal point of view is a very broad concept. It's a right. It is stated in the European Convention on Human Rights. Everyone has the right to respect for his private and family life, his home, and his correspondence. So as you can see, online privacy is not mentioned specifically because privacy is very broad. It concerns our everyday lives as well, not only what we're doing online, not only something we do related to software development. And this is a foundational concept, foundational right from which many things stem when we're going to talk about data protection as well. Security is a characteristic. We don't really have a really strict definition of security or cybersecurity, yet we have descriptions of characteristics. For example, in NIS directive, which soon will be replaced by NIS 2 directive, personal data are in many cases compromised as a result of incidents. And we are going to talk about the secure way of handling data from the legal point of view. And finally, data protection. In the European Union, it's recognized as a right, the right to personal data protection, yet it is mostly related to computers, technology, and automated decision-making, although data protection, personal data protection also applies in everyday life as well, paper-based, etc. Yet we are going to focus on technology side of the issue, specifically how do we deal with protecting personal data in software development lifecycle. Why treat it seriously? Well, of course, records for profiling, political oppression, ethnic cleansings were used notably in the past by many totalitarian regimes, Gestapo in Nazi Germany, Stasi in Eastern Germany, and both examples contributed to the reform of data protection privacy laws in Western Germany, and then in the European Union as well. Mass surveillance is conducted by modern states as well, such as China, Russia, and the United States. A recent example, a sad example of how personal data can be used to conduct ethnic cleansings is the way Russian army used government records which were hacked or leaked by local collaborators in Ukraine. And then it was used by Russian forces to execute civilians or veterans or activists on occupied territories in Ukraine. And it happens even now. So that is why we have to treat this issue seriously. We're going to talk about GDPR. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what it is. I won't be able to give a full explanation of what it is in this seminar, so I will just mention the very general points to take into account. It's one of the most comprehensive legal documents in the world when we're talking about protecting personal data. And many countries have followed the example of GDPR. GDPR is a European Union regulation. By many countries, I mean European Union legislation influenced the legislation of other European countries, Ukraine, Georgia, Turkey, those countries who are not members of the EU. The United Kingdom, following Brexit, decided to retain GDPR. It's basically a copy of GDPR, a GDP regulation of the EU called UK GDPR. And we can also see influence on the United States and other countries in the world. The GDPR envisions risk-based approach, and we can still take advantage of it when we're going to talk about SDLC. It was designed sort of as a single legal document to regulate data protection in the EU, although this year we had many new additions. It is easy to get confused, yet let's focus on GDPR as the most foundational document and explaining the main rules coming from it. It is applicable in the EU from May 2018. It replaced previous data protection directive and certain national laws, yet it is still far from perfect. I'll explain later why. What is personal data under GDPR? Let's go really fast through the main concepts of GDPR and switch to how we implement that in SDLC. So it's any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person. So we're not going to talk about company data, company information, and I emphasize on any information to an identified or identifiable natural person. So we're dealing with a really, really broad concept here. Article 5 GDPR states certain principles related to processing of personal data. And this is, you can consider it as a backbone, as a foundational principle, as a main framework, what you should always keep in mind when you're working on your software project and you wish to deploy it in the European Union or make it accessible to residents of the European Union. There are 6 principles which deal with the way you have to process, store, and get rid of personal data after you no longer need it. Also, the way you have to ensure its integrity and confidentiality or security principle. And then the seventh principle is called accountability. So you have to ensure that there is an institution or a person responsible for that processing and ensuring that compliance is achieved and personal data is protected. So those are 7 principles, or 6+1 principle relating to processing of personal data under GDPR. GDPR also envisions the rights of the data subject. You definitely heard of many of them, and you can logically deduce that that should be the right. For example, the right of access, where you have the right to access any personal data stored by someone about you, of course, with certain limitations, especially when it comes to government storing your data. But in general, whatever is gathered by someone about you, you have the right to access it and see what happens to it. You have the right to rectify it if you see any mistake, especially when it may affect your rights. You have the right to erase this data with certain limitations. and this right is widely known as the right to be forgotten. You possibly heard about the Court of Justice of the European Union, so-called Google case, where this right was explained and broadened. You might say even a foundation of it was laid, and Google had to enforce this policy of erasing certain records from its search engine. There is also a right to restrict processing, so any natural person has the right to ask any data processor, any company or any natural person, any business to stop processing their data, of course within certain legal limits. Every natural person has the right to be informed, the right to data portability, the right to object, of course. It is closely related to the right to restrict processing or to rectify. You have the right to object to any processing of your personal data, and the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing, which is extremely relevant for artificial intelligence-based apps, where certain decisions might be taken based purely on automated processing, but also to other applications as well. It is not absolute, of course. It doesn't mean that every piece of personal data has to be processed manually if the person says so. No, but you cannot really make decisions which influence person's life, person's rights, purely based on automated algorithm. There has to be certain supervision, and there has to be certain compliance with legal requirements on this. What are the basics of GDPR compliance for software development lifecycle? So first and foremost, assurance of appropriate technical and organizational measures, or TOMs. We're going to talk a lot about TOMs today. This is a loose set of rules. There is no any exhaustive list on what exactly those TOMs should be. Well, technical meaning things like encryption or ensuring cybersecurity, ensuring a secure way of handling data, protecting your data flow, protecting your cloud if you're doing any cloud processing. And organizational is something a little bit more mundane, yet still very important, like limiting access to your servers, limiting access to the premises where you store personal data, especially when we're talking about large companies where they process a lot of personal data and store a lot of records. You have to ensure internal documentation on data policies and procedures. Many small and medium enterprises don't do that. This is a mistake. Internal documentation is key because your employees have to be aware of how to secure data, what to do in case of emergency, what to do in case of a data breach. It shouldn't be a huge manual on 800 pages or so where you explain all the silly policies on what to do or whom to call. No, it can be a one-page document, yet it has to be there to ensure that your employees and everyone in your team are aware of what is going on and what you're dealing with. It is partially an organizational measure to inform your employees, especially those who are working with personal data. Designate a data protection officer, a person responsible for ensuring the protection of personal data and ensuring the compliance with legal requirements and standards. This can be a person with technical background, engineering background. This can be a person with legal background. There is no correct answer to what background is best. It all depends on what your company or your team does. Maybe a small team of developers, let's say 5 people, yet you process a lot of personal data. Most likely you will need a data protection officer. It can be a large company. Possibly you will need a whole department working on that. You will need to conduct a regular data protection impact assessment. It's a risk management instrument. I will talk about it in detail later. And you have to ensure the data protection by design, or its related concept, or some people say it is the same concept under a different name, privacy by design and by default. We're also going to talk about it later. I already mentioned data subjects' rights. You have to ensure that your architecture and your organizational measures allow to enforce those rights and do so effectively. And you have to ensure cooperation with national DPAs. Not very relevant in case of small and medium enterprises, smaller teams and smaller apps, yet it is a huge problem for big tech. If your company is anything more than 100 people, most likely you will interact with your National Data Protection Authority, that's DPA, at least once. Either you will inquire or you will receive an inquiry from them, and you will have to communicate. If you don't, it will result in fines and possibly even prosecution, depending on what violations are there. Some appropriate technical and organizational measures, TOMs. You remember the security principle I mentioned before, GDPR principle. And you have to consider things like risk analysis, organizational policies, physical and technical measures, something I mentioned before. Consider state of the art and the cost of implementation. This is a legal requirement as well. No one will require a small app to pay billions of euros to ensure the security of their data. And in most cases, you won't secure it from everyone anyway, even with the billion euros. You have to consider state of the art, what technologies are available, what technologies are effective, how much does it cost. You make this risk assessment, you make this risk analysis, consider the challenges, and you make a decision. The decision is purely yours, yet there are certain rules you have to follow. Like in most cases, pseudonymization and encryption are technologies or measures required in almost all cases. Confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your systems and services and the personal data stored there must be ensured in case there is a blackout, like happened with Facebook last year, and millions and hundreds of millions of users couldn't access their personal data. If that happens for a couple of hours, not a big problem. If that happens for a prolonged period, then it is a problem from the legal side, because people don't know what happens with their personal data. They have to be informed, and you have to ensure effective compliance. This, of course, means that you have to restore access and availability to personal data in case this happens. And whatever measures you have implemented, whatever TOMs you have implemented, you have to constantly monitor their effectiveness and change them if necessary. So why should the IT crowd care? First of all, of course, already mentioned that this is a legal requirement, and in some cases, people's lives depend on it, or a lot of money, depending what is more important for you. But data protection by design is one of the most and foremost legal requirements. Is it the same as privacy by design? It depends on whom you ask. I will give you definitions of both so you can compare, and we'll talk about it. And it helps to fill in this gap between the law, the legal requirements, and software engineering practices. Actually, it is designed in a way that you can intertwine both, you can implement both, and they will work naturally with each other. TOMS, as I already mentioned, it's a loose set of rules, so you have to conduct your own analysis depending on the project you're working on. Again, there is no exhaustive list of TOMS. So you will have to do your own thinking, your own analysis, and ultimately your own decision at your own risk. And DPIA, it's just an element of a risk management system. It's also part of a risk management process. And in many cases, it is a major issue for IT companies because it requires a considerable amount of time. It requires a considerable amount of number of experts working on this. And then, of course, DPIA might become an issue if your company belongs to the big tech and you earn most of your money by violating the legal provisions and actually selling this data or processing it illegally or unethically. Then, of course, DPIA will show that certain processing activities are not necessarily allowed, but you have to maybe ensure more safeguards there. And of course, it will require a bigger budget for that. Yet it is a legal requirement, and of course, I call on you, if you work on a software project, conduct a DPIA in any case, even if it is a simple procedure. We're going to talk about it slightly later, and I'll walk you through the steps necessary for the DPIA in software projects. So data protection by design, why, how, and when. So this is the definition of privacy by design. Privacy by design was formulated, the concept, by Anne Cowichan, an Information Privacy Commissioner of Ontario, province of Ontario in Canada. And the definition might seem a little bit wordy, but the main idea is that you have to incorporate your privacy in your systems and in your technologies by default. You have to always think about it even before you start working on a software project, even at the stage of planning, at the very initial stage of any software development lifecycle process, any software project. You have to consider privacy. You have to consider how you will ensure that users' rights are protected. And of course, privacy must be embedded in every protocol, in every process, because with every year it becomes more and more important. Privacy by design was formulated in 1990s, this concept again in Canada, yet it was implemented in the European Union as well, albeit under a slightly different name, because in GDPR, European Union General Data Protection Regulation, these are 7 principles, forgot to mention, I'm sorry, 7 principles of privacy by design. They're relevant for the data protection by design, the way it was implemented in GDPR as well, more or less. So the idea of privacy by design, it should be proactive and not reactive, preventative and not remedial. Again, you have to think about it while developing an app and not after you did that. And then you have to deal with consequences, and especially with inquiries from users or from data protection authorities. Privacy as the default, so it has to be your default standard. You have to make it one of your top priorities, as well as security. Privacy must be embedded into design, so it's not really a tick you do, it's not one thing you achieve. It is a continuous process, and it has to be embedded into your software design. So with every iteration you make, with every sprint, it all depends on what methodology you follow, but I will use certain concepts from Agile development, software development process. It has to be embedded. It has to follow you everywhere, really. You have to ensure full functionality, positive sum, not zero sum, and you have to ensure end-to-end security. It is closely related, of course, to cybersecurity. So these two, information security, application security, and privacy, they always go together, of course, because privacy depends on technical security and also on the TOMs you implement and how you design the system in general. This is the primary motivation to consider privacy requirements from the very beginning. You have to ensure visibility and transparency, and you have to ensure respect for user. In the European Union, you ensure respect for user by respecting their rights, those I mentioned before, to object, to access, to stay informed, etc. Well, I don't want you to read this definition. I want you to take a look at it. This is how data protection by design, not privacy by design, data protection by design is defined in Article 25 GDPR. If you're interested in the topic, you can check Article 25 on your own. My idea was to show how lawyers, how we like to complicate things and how we like to describe it with many, many synonyms, but ultimately it all means the same thing, really, in a nutshell. Of course, some diehard fans of data protection by design might argue with me, but in my opinion, privacy by design and data protection by design are extremely related and extremely overlapped. And if you want a mundane interpretation of data protection by design, according to GDPR, always think about personal data protection when developing something, developing a software project, most importantly, and apply necessary measures based on the state of the art, their effectiveness, cost, and the risk for users. So this is the mundane interpretation. This is not a legal definition, but I think it might be enough in most cases. Yet when you're working on a project itself, of course, refer to documents. And when you do this, the way we try to explain the elements of data protection by design, the elements of the requirements, consider state of the art. Again, you think about what technologies are at your disposal, what is available now. Of course, quantum encryption is not yet commercially available to everyone, but once it is, most likely we will have to switch to it. You have to consider cost of implementation. You have to think about your budget, and you have to strike a balance between what you're doing with personal data and what is the scale, and as well as consider whether it is actually smart to spend so much money on it. Of course, there are requirements you have to take into account. Always think about security and privacy from the legal point of view. You won't escape it. You won't be able to say, oh, sorry, the price was too high, so we didn't do that, although many companies try to say so. Yet cost of implementation is, of course, taken into account when you're thinking about implementation of certain privacy preserving technologies, privacy enhancing technologies, and data protection measures. Consider nature, scope, context, and purposes of processing. Of course, it all depends on what personal data and how much data you actually process. If you deal with something small and you don't work on many things, you don't process much data, or you don't process it at all, then of course it is of much lesser priority for you. But the absolute majority of applications process personal data. In 90% of the cases, you will have to implement data protection by design. Then you consider risks for rights and freedoms of natural persons. So despite the fact that I listed it this way, that it doesn't mean the state of the art or cost, they come first before rights and freedoms of natural persons. No, not at all. Rights and freedoms, of course, come first, and this is the thing you consider in the first place. This is your top priority when we are talking about privacy and security. For this, you conduct a risk management assessment or data protection, data processing impact assessment, the instrument I mentioned earlier. And you do this at the time of the determination of the means for processing. So when you are thinking about how will you process this data through the app, through the website, what will you do with this? And at the time of processing. So again, this process is with you all the time. It's not one tick, it's not one thing. You implemented one piece of code, you've drafted and inserted or copy pasted from Stack Overflow. No, it doesn't work like that. You will have to constantly come back to it, see whether it's effective, see whether it's according to the state of the art, whether the cost is adequate, etc., etc. Of course, you implement TOMs. TOMs are instruments to achieve data protection by design, inter alia. And of course, these TOMs, they have to be designed to implement data protection principles. Those principles I mentioned before. So now you can see that these are all pieces of one huge puzzle. They are all related to each other. They all depend on each other. This is a complicated system, and that's why most likely you will either need an external consultant for that, or a person trained in data protection by design, or in implementing privacy requirements in your team, depending, of course, on the scope of your processing. Data protection by design, it's a risk-based approach. I mentioned all of the elements before, yet these are elements stated in GDPR. You can consult articles 24 and 25 for more details. You have to implement TOMs. Again, this is a legal requirement. And here I suggest a close collaboration between IT and legal experts, because most likely you will need both. And if your project is really large scale, most likely you will need a whole department dedicated to that. Ensure and demonstrate compliance with the GDPR. It's not only about ticking again the requirements, thinking that, okay, we did that, we did this, we kind of hired someone who's pretending that they're working on ensuring the privacy and security of our data and data processing activities. No, it doesn't work like that. You have to be proactive in this case. You have to actually implement the risk mitigation strategies, and you have to demonstrate accountability. So data protection by design in software development lifecycle. It's not a new idea. Of course, it was formulated long before, yet it becomes more important with every year. You might think of it in terms of legal tech or in terms of applying artificial intelligence solutions for IT lawyers, and then this close collaboration between law and technology, law and software projects. And we have a really close interaction actually between legal text and code. Actually, legal texts in many cases resemble code, because law in a nutshell is also a set of norms or set of algorithms everyone has to follow. And this gives us an opportunity not only to make a useless comparison, but also to see how these elements fit and how we can connect them to each other and how we can make them work in terms of SDLC. There is a problem with defining terms and explaining them clearly, especially when it comes to your policies. I already mentioned the differences between technical and legal terminology, and I already mentioned the difference, albeit a small one, between the way technical people, software engineers, approach risk mitigation strategies, especially when it comes to privacy, and legal requirements for such mitigation strategies. I wouldn't say that some approach is better than the other. They are just a bit different because most likely people focus on different things. Lawyers, they think about legal requirements, of course, about rights, while software developers in most cases think about security of data in the first place, while not really thinking about why should we do this, on what rights we have to rely. And this is the reason for why you should always keep in mind the legal requirement, because that's why you are working on implementing privacy and data protection in your project in the first place. And of course, there is an issue with stakeholders, especially in a complicated environment with a lot of stakeholders, with cloud providers, with edge computing providers. If we're talking about, for example, 5G networks, something I'm working on, there are hundreds of stakeholders in certain verticals where every stakeholder has a different approach to privacy, different approach to security, and of course, making them communicate, making them talk, making them thinking about rights and obligations rather than about their own interest. It is extremely hard. Let's switch to the company case. Let's take an outsourced IT company case and see how we can implement privacy requirements here in software development lifecycle model. I took a very basic one, which starts with planning, followed by analysis, then by design of the model, then by implementation, testing, and maintenance. Who are people responsible for different stages? The planning, I would argue, it's chief technical officer or someone working in that place, project officer or product owner, and then architect. In analysis, of course, you have business analysis department, then project manager or product owner. In design, you see that tech lead is taking charge, and of course, in implementation, tech lead together with developers and project management. Our project manager and project management team are working on the implementation of solution itself. And then in testing and maintenance, you have all these guys accompanied by quality assurance department. So this is a very, very basic concept. If you ever worked on a software project, you're familiar with it. Where do we add? We add data protection officers for lawyers. So definitely at the stage of planning, you already have to involve a person responsible for privacy and adhering to privacy requirements. This person, as I mentioned before, has to be trained and has to be aware of legal requirements as well as standards. It might be a lawyer with considerable technical skills and understanding of the software development process, or it might be an engineer who was trained in GDPR, as well as other regulations. If we're talking about the EU, most and foremost, it would be GDPR, knows how to apply them correctly and regularly follows the updates, because case law develops every day. Court of Justice adopts a number of decisions related to personal data protection and privacy in the EU, and you have to take those changes into account for sure. Then, of course, you involve lawyers or DPOs at the analysis stage, because when you're thinking about what you're going to do, what the software project strives to achieve, what might be the very, very basic architecture, you will need input from them. When it comes to design, you may involve or you may not involve. It really depends on the way your team works. I would, of course, say involve lawyers or DPOs in all stages. Yet, once you get the input, at least the general one, you work on design on your own, and then you can involve DPOs or lawyers at a later stage to see if everything is according to their input, developed, drafted, and submitted during planning and analysis stages. When it comes to implementation itself, you have to consult the DPO to see whether your solutions were implemented correctly, whether they're effective, whether they're working the way they should be, and whether whether they comply with legal requirements. Then at testing and maintenance stage, it's not necessary, in my opinion, to involve DPO at all iterations, yet there has to be a developer or project manager who has to always keep an eye on elements concerning personal data processing or ensuring privacy in your application or your software project. And once certain iterations, they change functionality, even if this is a really small change, then you have to consult the DPO and get their input, whether it still complies with the idea of the project and with legal requirement or not. Also, the DPO from their side, they have to constantly come back and monitor your project, especially if this is an ongoing project with a lot of personal data involved, and constantly consider, are there any new developments when it comes to privacy enhancing technologies or law, whether you need to implement certain changes. Yet, once again, it's not necessary to do so at every iteration. When it comes to planning, you focus, when it comes to data protection, on team knowledge, skills, and methodology. Team, yes, you involve the person, depending on the size of your team and what you're working on, who will be in charge of ensuring data protection and privacy. You have to ensure their knowledge and their skills. That's why training, developers training or DPO training is key. But even if you have a person responsible for that, all developers, all project managers, quality assurance department, everyone working on the app or on the software project in general, they have to have at least general understanding on what personal data is and why it is important to protect it and how they can do this. And if they have any questions or they require an input, who they can contact. And of course, you have to choose the right methodology when it comes to implementing privacy requirements. There are a number. You can consider Linden, developed by KU Leuven, and there are also other methodologies, but it all depends, again, on the nature scope of your processing. At the analysis stage, consider privacy requirements engineering. Consider privacy requirements as key elements in your backlog. Think about them as necessary steps as it would be with development of any other feature in the app, because they are essential. And here, certain examples of privacy requirements would be defining categories of personal data, defining who user is and how to ensure their rights, who the owner of the data is, who the controller is, who the processor is, all according to GDPR. I will not focus on this in this seminar. Yet it is important to work on this at the stage of analysis. Applying risk management and risk mitigation strategies when it comes to privacy and personal data. Then data protection principles, GDPR data protection principles, data protection by design, and of course data processing impact assessment. You have to implement it at this stage and conduct it and then see how your software project might, what effect it might have on users' rights, and what can you do about it, what requirements are key for your project in this regard. At the design stage, you work on data minimization mechanisms, you work on security of data for sure. You can follow, especially you're developing a software project for the European Union, you can follow the principles related to processing personal data stated in GDPR. This can serve as a sort of a template for your requirements. And as long as you fulfill all of the principles, then you can be sure that your project is in compliance with legal requirements. Optimization of processing, because less is always better. The less you process data, the less you refer to your databases, the more secure it is. And of course, the less data you process, data minimization, the better and more secure system is. Work on documentation of processing activities, perhaps in a different backlog, or maybe implement it in your general backlog, but document all activities which will happen in your software project, map a data flow, see where your data goes, always keep an eye on it, and there should be no gray areas or things like, yes, at this stage we send data to a cloud service in China or Russia or Iran, but nothing's going to happen there. Those are reliable guys, or any other country, United States or whatever. You have to know what happens to your data at all times and what processing activities are taking place. This is the stage where you actually start already implementing data protection by design, despite that this is a design stage. But of course, you keep those requirements in mind. And most and foremost, despite this, again, put the last in the list, it's data subjects rights, because all of these steps before I mentioned, all of them are because of data subjects rights. Keep all those rights together with principles at all times in front of your eyes, and always check every step you take, any functionality you implement, whether they are aimed at ensuring data subjects rights. If at any stage any functionality threatens data subjects rights, rethink it. This is the main advice. Don't cut corners. This will lead to really dire consequences in the future, because after you implement your project, it will be really hard to change the key and core concepts of your architecture. At the implementation stage, you of course think about tools already. What about encryption? What about pseudonymization or anonymization of data? How you process it? What technical measures you can apply here? And you of course rethink software modules and elements after initial deploy. After you see how your system works, consider rethinking privacy requirements as well, whether this field test was successful or not, because you can already begin this phase of quality assurance when it comes to privacy as early as possible. I would actually say this must be together with security, the things you have to retest and assure the quality at the very beginning, before everything else. Implement privacy requirements in your code and processes review. Set it as a separate notion, as a separate story to always come back to. And again, think about data protection by design, whether your implementation actually correlates with the concept you shared, you envisioned, and whether everything is aimed at ensuring data subjects' rights. And then finally, testing and maintenance stage. It's check and control, just like with any other functionality. You do the same with privacy, data protection and security, data security and data protection requirements. Check how they were implemented, test them. Perhaps rethink your threat model. Conduct a review, see whether it was effective, whether your choice of methodology was correct at the beginning. It's not a problem to change it at this stage, because TOMS will most likely be the same, but maybe you will need to switch some of your priorities. Of course, privacy will be a thing to consider in processes review. See that all the processing, again, are in compliance with legal requirements and with standards. And again, think about data protection by design. This will be your friend and your curse for the rest of the existence of your software project. As long as you process personal data, data protection by design is key, because it leads to compliance and ensuring data subjects' rights. How it is in Agile software development. Some basic principles of integrating privacy requirements in Agile, but it will be applicable to many software projects working on other methodologies for sure. Well, privacy is closely related to security. So application, again, and application security and information security, they go hand to hand with privacy. I wouldn't say that security depends on privacy, but privacy definitely depends on security. So your security team will work closely with DPO and your privacy experts during the SDLC process, the development of the project. Consider creating specific, in case of GDPR, really specific requirements, such as GDPR storage limitation principle integration. How do you integrate this functionality? How do you limit the storage of personal data in your project when you don't need it? Make it automated if possible, so you don't need to manually keep an eye on it. And again, privacy is not a single standalone issue. You cannot just say, okay, privacy requirement is this particular thing in our backlog. It's just one requirement. We do something there and okay, it's fulfilled. We don't come back to it except our DPO shouts at us. No, it is a complicated process. You will need a dedicated developer or even developers for this. And you will need really, really specific requirements. Privacy should come in epics and stories, just like other requirements in the overall product backlog. You have to consider developing specific, privacy-specific, or even data protection and privacy-specific separate epics and stories. And then also test it on a user story, because only then you will get a working picture before you actually deploy the product and it starts affecting people's lives, users' rights. And of course, conduct regular reviews involving all team members responsible, especially data protection officer or legal counsel, or both if you have both, because ensuring compliance in this stage is key. It will again lead to less problems in the future. The second part is these specific legal requirements, they should become a crucial part of your risk management process. Whatever process you choose, whatever risk mitigation strategy, risk management process, whatever risk mitigation strategy you employ, specific legal requirements have to be there. Again, don't put it as one requirement. Always work, strive to be as specific as possible, make multiple elements. Don't, of course, overcrowd the project, overcomplicate it, but don't treat it as a standalone issue. List all relevant privacy and security requirements when it comes to legal compliance and track them, of course, how they're implemented, and put a person responsible for that, both from the development team and from compliance team, whether that's a lawyer or an engineer trained in compliance. Consider the costs, but almost in all cases, you will have to opt out for better privacy and security. I'm talking about legal requirements. I'm not talking about shady ways different big tech companies are cutting corners. We're talking about the way it should be, not the way you can save money on users' rights. Follow GDPR principles, and as I mentioned before, and always follow, see what the things you're implementing, what they are for. They're always for data subjects' rights, not in order to comply with certain abstract legal requirement. It's always about users. They're people, they're real people. Think about their rights and how they work in a real life situation involving a software project. It's a continuous process. Certain GDPR provisions are really fit with SDLC. So it is a de facto legal requirement to implement GDPR into SDLC, unless you don't work with personal data at all. But there will be not so many software projects doing that. It is, of course, in form of technical and organizational measures, TOMs, policies, implementing measures, data minimization, data pseudonymization, and you can see relevant recitals and articles of GDPR below if you're interested more in this topic and you wish to read more. Other recitals and articles are related to encryption, anonymization, and pseudonymization. It does not guarantee compliance on its own, but GDPR lists a lot of certain technologies and measures you have to take. Consult again these recitals and articles for more. I mentioned some key like encryption and pseudonymization on this slide already. Inform the data subject.
Beware to leave some time for questions.
Okay, I'll speed up a little bit. So you have to always inform the data subject about their rights. It's a requirement as well. Monitor and communicate with third parties who store user personal data, especially when it's a cloud service provider. And of course, it's a legal obligation to adhere to a retention period. Automize it as soon as possible, if it is possible. Data processing impact assessment, it's a process to help you identify and minimize the risks of software project. You have the requirements listed here. They are listed in the GDPR, of course. Perhaps it's not necessary to consider it as a purely independent thing. You can easily fit it with your general risk management process. Just involve DPO for that and your legal counsel for that. Don't have much time left, so I will focus only on the most important things. This is the diagram explaining how data processing impact assessment can be integrated with SDLC. You can see that it really reminds the way any software project is developed, the way software development lifecycle is drafted. Same with DPIA. You can easily link certain steps of DPIA to relevant parts of SDLC. Some things you have to consider first and foremost: developer training, at least some basic awareness training in your team, whether it's small or huge, will save you from a lot of problems in the future. Consider applicable law, of course, what markets you are going to deploy your app to, tools and methods, and involve legal counsel and DPO. They will advise you on all the necessary steps. The challenges include lack of qualified specialists, of course, unclear regulation and lack of case law. Yes, lawyers like to complicate things. It's easier for us and it's harder for everyone else. And but unclear regulations and not sufficient case law, even at this stage, despite GDPR being enforced for 4 years, creates a considerable challenge to whether we are sure that our project is compliant with legal requirements. And of course, state of the art. This is always a problem, especially considering how do we balance it with costs. What happens in the future with implementation of privacy in SDLC? The answer is very simple. Nobody knows. That is why you have to constantly monitor the changes, technology changes, as well as legal developments in the field. This was the major part of my presentation. If you have any questions, I would be really glad to answer them.